Hello everyone and welcome back to another AFL Fantasy Fanatics pre-season video. Got another special guest and a different topic we're going to be covering today. Obviously you guys have just heard our midfield episode a few days ago and then my midfielder rankings on YouTube. But I thought we'd go delve into the opening round strategy and chat a bit of that and see what we're going to be doing ahead of the 2025 season with a couple of little changes to opening round. But I'm your host Bales and you can find me at BAILSDT across the socials. And joining me is another very special guest, two-time top 10 finisher and 2021 runner-up. It is Holmsey from the PODPOD. Holmsey, mate, how are you?
Yeah, good, Bales. Thanks for having me on. It's been a while since I've been on the Fanatics, so thanks for having me back. And yeah, always good to chat to you, mate. I love what you do, all the content you put out. So yeah, happy to get involved.
Beautiful. No, thanks, mate. It's great to have you on and get on such a successful coach from two times in the top 10. How's the preseason been treating? Obviously, it's starting to ramp up a little bit as we get close to the season. I think we're under 8 weeks to go, and we're sort of only about a month away from some match sims and practice games getting under. So how's the preseason research coming along for you?
Yeah, look, it's been good. I've kind of told myself over the last couple of years to kind of take it a little bit easier in the preseason. I can find myself a little bit burnt out once the season comes, and there's really only so much research you can do in the preseason when we really just need to see games and see how the teams are lining up. But with the PodPod taking that over and doing the Holmes files and the PodPod episodes, I've probably been doing more research and more work than I ever have. But it has been good. And I don't know about you, but the DFS website at the moment is absolutely unreal, and it's gone up another level, and it's made everything a hell of a lot easier and more accessible, which is really good.
Oh, yeah. DFS Australia is one of the first websites to go to for any preseason research. If anyone out there's not using it, then you're missing a trick because it's got so much incredible stuff and it's sort of got all the stats from every season. It's just sort of the one thing, but there's just so many more resources on it as well. And it's gone to another level ahead of 2025. So, as I said, I thought we'd chat about opening rounds. So we had that last year. It's back again for another season, which for some people it's annoying, but other coaches, they're quite happy with opening round because it adds another layer of strategy. So I thought we'd probably quickly just go back to last year, Holmesy. So that obviously was a very new thing, watching actual games of football count for premiership points, but not actually count towards their fantasy scores. And then adding the extra layer of the double price movements. If players put up good scores, you start them. If they put up poor scores, maybe you didn't start them. So talk me through how you sort of approached last year with those rounds. I think it was rounds 2, 3, 5, and 6. We had the buys. So talk me through how you dealt with it last year.
Yeah, look, I think we were all going in blind last year. So, we're all kind of guessing about how we should go about it. But the general consensus was that the rookies and the mid prices were okay to look at. It was a really good opportunity to see them in their roles at AFL level. And especially the rookies, we didn't really know how those price rises were going to go. But looking last year, I think Seth Campbell was the prime example. So Seth Campbell came out in opening round and scored a 60, I think it was. And a lot of good coaches just put him in their side. And I didn't, because I didn't really like the role at Richmond. But him just getting that 60, that just got his cash going straight away. And it just kept snowballing because he was already in that price cycle. So the rookies are super important, not only because we get a genuine look at their role, but if they do put up a good score, their cash is flying. And mid prices as well. I mean, there is a little bit of fantasy IQ that needs to go into it, because a lot of the times we do see in opening round or round one, we can see players put up scores that aren't necessarily going to be reflective of what they do in the real season as it gets further on. But the mid prices, it's good to have a look at the role as well. But the premiums is where it's a bit interesting, Bales, and it's good to get your thoughts as well. So the consensus was don't start any premiums that have a buy, and then the winner of the comp started a premium with the buy and traded him out. So where are you at with the premiums?
Yeah, and that was what was funny. Obviously, hearing Chris Tawney on the Holmes files about that, saying how he started Tom Green just to trade him out and planned it, which I've never gone into starting a season, and obviously opening around different layer, but I've never started a premium knowing I'm going to trade them out after a certain few games. So it was very new to me. I normally I'm sort of a little bit more, as everyone would say, the older school mentality of you pick a player, premium, you keep them there until they get injured or suspended or something happens and you need to trade them out. So I never actually looked at starting a Tom Green. And with those particularly with the rounds 2 and 3 buy players. I'd never really looked at starting any preems. I considered an Errol Goulden, for example, at the round 5 or 6 buy, something like that. Dacos was also another player I looked at, but especially when Goulden dropped that lower score. But I thought, well, if you get that premium for the first 6 rounds, if they're only playing 5 games, they've got to essentially outperform all the other premiums by like 15 points, which you'd be looking at a 120 average, which Tom Green actually was going at, funny enough, with that start. But you're relying on them going big like that early. Otherwise, you had like I know that Bont was bad last year, but if you started someone like a Bontempelli or a Brayshaw or someone like that played the extra game, they would only just average about 100 or just above to really sort of stay in touch with those early buy players. That's probably where I was leaning towards it. Is that sort of where you were at as well? You weren't looking at starting any of those top price players?
Yeah, well, last year I certainly wasn't. We started a fair amount of premiums, but they all sort of presented value, like your Whitfield, your Gawn, your Heaney. All those players had buys, but they all presented some pretty serious value. But just back on that premium point, what's glossed over is the fact that even though you are having a premium on the buy, you still get to replace that player with a rookie. So it's not like that spot on the field is scoring 0 for you. You are still replacing them with a rookie. And because they're on a buy as well, you're going to get 2 chances at that rookie. So it's not just they need to, so say they're averaged at 100, they need to go 115 to make up those points. You are still going to get some points from a rookie. Now, you might get a stinking 30 or a 40. That's just fantasy. But last year, there were rookies that were putting up 75s and 80s, and you might only have lost 10 or 15 points. And then that premium comes back on the field. So there might be space for the right premium if they're going to outscore their price. They still need to present some value. I don't think you look at paying for a player that's fairly priced. But if you like a player on the buy because they have a really good run and you think they can get off to a fly, then I don't think we rule it out just yet.
Yeah, and I think this year potentially could be a year where people look at it, because I think a lot of it's been spoken about already. The draft class from this previous crop are really, really good, and especially those midfielders. And a lot of people are starting a few of them on the ground, but maybe a couple of expensive ones on the bench. So you might be able to have a couple of cracks at 2 pretty decent rookies, especially in that midfield. So we'll talk about a couple of those premium options towards the end of sort of the strategy chat. Just going quickly back onto 2024 as well, in terms of the split, how it was split between the first 2 rounds and then the last 2 rounds, and you had that thing was gather round right in the middle. Were you sort of more hesitant and not looking to start those round 2 and 3, but a little bit more open to starting the players at the later 2 buys?
Yeah, the later buys definitely had more of an advantage. I think in round 6 they would have had 5 price rises to that point, or maybe even 6 with the round 0. So there was a lot of time for those premiums or mid prices to actually make their cash and then get off them. So that's fine. I didn't really look at any round 2 buy players, but I know most of us, or a lot of us, started Zach Williams, but I think he was a bit different because he was a mid price option. But yeah, going on this year with GWS and Gold Coast having that buy in round 2, I don't think you can start many of those players because they're only going to have 2 price rises between opening round and their buy. So they're still going to be cheap enough to get on after their buy. And maybe that's where there's a bit of strategy coming in, where I'm sure we're going to talk about it, where there's a lot of round 3 buy players that maybe if you do like someone that has a buy in round 2, that you kind of pencil in a trade to go down to there once the player's on the buy. But that's how I'm sort of looking at it at the moment.
Yeah, I'm of the same opinion as well. And then sort of final thing, which sort of leads us into the early buys for this year, is obviously you talked about those value players, the guys that presented value, like your Lockie Whitfield, your Max Gawn, your Isaac Heaney's, players like that. Is where many of them sort of in calculation for you heading into the season, and with that bigger score, you're just like, lock them in because of the value? Or did a few of them maybe sort of pop their head up after the opening round score and you considered if you're going to put him into the team or not?
Max Gawn was always one that was in my team, with the fact that Luke Jackson had left and he was going to be the solo ruck for the first time in 3 years. Him priced at 90 was just far too good to pass up. So Max Gawn was always in. Heaney was in from the moment that there was talk that he was going to have that midfield time, and then we saw it in the practice matches. In a year where we were lacking forward options, he just stood out. So he was in as well. But obviously the opening round helped to solidify that with his role in his scoring. Whitfield was always someone that I liked and was looking at. I know I drafted him. I got him real late, which was really good. But he was too hard to pass up after his 130 or whatever it was in round 0. So that's where round 0 can be a bit of a curse as well, because everyone gets to see round 0 and everyone's going to flock to these players if they do put up good round 0 scores. And that's why I kind of like Selby's mentality, where you kind of hope that some of these popular players maybe put up a 60 or a 70, and it forces you to choose a little bit, because we don't want everyone to have the same team.
Exactly right. Yeah. And then on the other hand, it sort of throws up those players where I know Mitch was talking about it. He was locked into Max Gawn and Tristan Cherry, but Grundy forced everyone's hand, and it ended up being the Gawn and Cherry was probably the right sort of starting combo. So it sort of can have that effect of you might jump on a player. Like I jumped on a Christian Salem after that game, after seeing that midfield role, and it'd been talked about in the preseason. It was him or Jordan Clark, and end up going for Salem with that extra cash rise. And really, if it wasn't for that 50-something point quarter he had against Hawthorn, I believe it was in the last quarter, it would have been a complete failure of a pick. Whereas it ended up being okay. I jumped off after round 4 and ahead of his early buy, but it sort of getting Jordan Clark would have been the better play. So it can opening round can sort of throw up some funny things, and which leads us into this year, which is the big change is there's no gap between the early buys, and that there's 4 teams on that round 3 buy. So the round 2 buy, you've got Gold Coast and GWS. The round 3 buy, you've got Brisbane, Sydney, Collingwood, and Geelong. And then round 4, you've got Essendon and Hawthorn. So I think the thing we've got to cover first is that round 3 buy, Holmesy. Is it pretty much you're trying to limit as little a player as possible in your starting squad from that round 3 buy, particularly in defence where we've got a lot of those good options?
Yeah, look, I think so. You can't fully limit it, because whether we like it or not, at this point in time, these players that we like are on this buy. Now that might all change when we start seeing some games and opening round. But we're all picking Bailey Smith, so there's one. We're all likely picking a Kitty Coleman if he gets up for round 0 and plays round 1. So there's 2. You can't avoid it. You're just going to have to be. Yeah, exactly right. If he gets to the breaking into a premiership team is going to be tough, but you'd think if anyone can do it, he can. So look, we have to take it head on, and who knows, maybe it is a brave coach that takes on and maybe cops a lower score for that round and then moves on. Who knows, if everyone's too scared to start too many of these players, but they turn out to be the right players, then that could be the play. What's good about this year is, well, not good, but different, is that the buy rounds are all condensed into 3 weeks rather than over that 6-week period. So I think that's going to lean more to the coaches that play the more value model. I think last year, the guns and rookies, although the winners, they were a little bit more mid-priced heavy. I know a lot of good teams got out to a really good start because they were picking more of a guns and rookies style team that got the points on the board, but were able to limit the rookies, where I think you could get found out this year if you go down that path.
Yeah, and I guess that's the good thing is round 1's the only round up until round 5 where we'll have best 18 all the other rounds, and round 1's the only one we got best 22. So do you think coaches might be able to take an extra risk or two, potentially starting a riskier, like let's use Adam Chera, for example. A lot of P's getting a bit of buzz at the moment in the pre-season, obviously a couple of good early fixtures, but the obviously injury history is there. We saw like last year, guys like a Dane Zorko end up being obviously we didn't see what he was going to do last year, but it ended up being, it probably was a good play to bring him in that period because it's best 18 and it had that sort of security blanket there. Do you think that this year you can maybe take on an extra player like an Adam Chera or someone like that in your starting squad because of the best 18 in 3 of the first sort of 4 or 5 weeks?
To be honest, mate, I don't think that changes my thinking at all. Like, players are only injury prone until they're not. Like before last year, you're right, Dane Zorko was injury prone. The year before that was Tim English, who some of us didn't pick because we were worried that he was injury prone, and he blew it out of the water. So look, maybe you take an extra one on in terms of maybe in years gone by you wouldn't have started an Adam Chera and a Sean Darcy, or an example like that where you've got 2 players that are perennially been injured. But look, if they have a flawless preseason, they're fit and healthy come round 1, you pick them, and the cards they either fall your way or they don't. I don't think the best 18 is going to sort of change that for me too much.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree with that as well. I think that as you say, that I think that mid-priced sort of and value play a lot is going to be potentially the play this year. And we obviously see in defence a lot of those high-priced defenders up there and probably fairly priced or might come back, whereas you might have to try and get some value there and might be able to take on an extra sort of value player and defence without the early buy potentially. But obviously, as I said, all 3 of the weeks are sort of back to back, which is obviously very good for us. But round 3 is going to, as I said, potentially cause cover issues. So I thought we'd quickly just chat about some of those defender players that are there. So obviously from Brisbane, you've got a Kitty Coleman, who obviously very underpriced based on what we've seen him do in the past, but coming off an ACL. You've also then got Geelong. You've got a couple of like Max Holmes, Tom Stewart, Lawson Humphreys. Sydney, you've got the duo in Matt Roberts and Callum Mills. And then from Collingwood, you've got Dan Houston, who we don't get to see in opening round because of his last game suspension, and then a Harry Perryman. Sort of how many is too many? Because I think a lot of these players are good options, and obviously we haven't seen them play yet, but you sort of have a number that you'd prefer to keep it to, or could you even do an option where you did what Chris did last year, start an extra one with the thought of potentially trading them out at round 3 because they'll have a couple of price rises? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think everything needs to be on the table. I don't hate the idea now. Everything needs to go right, and you need to make sure you don't have any forced trades in that round. But I don't hate the idea of starting, 3 or 4 of these players with the potential of maybe going to a Gold Coast or a GWS player when they come off their bye. Like, say you really like a Dan Rioli, say he goes to Gold Coast and he's got that role that Flanders had last year, where he's just able to rack up the ball in the back line, but you're not willing to start him with that early round bye. He has round 0 and then plays the Eagles. Say he gets off to a flyer and you want to get him in round 3. You've got an avenue to do that if you've got some of these players on the bye. Or maybe you're just taking a bit of a hit for that week. It'll depend on how solid the rest of your squad's looking. But yeah, I don't have a number at the moment, but I do know I'm interested in a lot of those players. But at the same time, we can poke a lot of holes in these players too.
Yeah, exactly right. Because they're a little bit cheaper for a reason, or they have gone to different situations, and you sort of were not sort of quite sure exactly what they're going to do at their new club. Does a lot of it have to do with some of these value players? Does it have to do with score and role in opening round these preseason games, or even like last year we saw Max go and have a lower score? If the role is better but their score is lower, are you still happy? Like, for example, let's say Callum Mills was in a sort of a half wing, half midfield role, and he went and put up a 70, 75. Would you still be happy enough to start him because of the role, or do you think that you'd want to see the points on the board to get that sort of that cash gen flowing early as well?
Callum Mills for me would purely be role. If he had a 50% plus midfield role and he was rotating on a wing, then that's all I'd need to see. Everyone can have a poor game to start, but if we saw him in defence, that's something else I'd need to look at. I probably wouldn't pick him if he was starting in defence, just with historically what he's done. Kitty Coleman, I think, is an interesting one. If he's playing, he's clearly going to have the role. But if he doesn't put up the points, I'm not sure I would start him, just because I think he's going to be a bit of a risk coming off that ACL. He's a prime management candidate. I think he could get a vest in his first game or two, which would maybe get him through to the bye, get him a little bit more fit and healthy, and then away we go. So he's someone I think probably deserves a little bit more discussion. He's not necessarily just the layup pick, but he is going to be hard to pass up if he is playing round 0, because that assumes that he is ready to go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's going to be a very interesting one, because it's sort of, I want to see him in those practice games, because of we know about like Zach Williams last year, I think Wayne Miller a few years ago as well, where they don't play these practice games and you start them and then they don't quite work out the way you want. And as you say, if Kitty Coleman gets a vest or two early, then that's going to obviously not only stunt his cash gen, but you've got a low score potentially already baked into your best 18 or even best 22 if it's round 1, then he gets an early vest. So he's going to be a very, very interesting one to watch. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on with the early buys? Obviously, a couple of things are different, and obviously you talked about the potential sort of value plays, the way to go. But is there any sort of other opening round things that you think probably needs a little bit more discussion, or you wanted to quickly chat about?
Well, I mean, I'll throw it back to you. What are your thoughts on this idea that because it's condensed for 3 rounds, do you think coaches might get found out round 5, round 6, round 7, moving into the mid-season buys if they do start too many rookies? Because it is the flavour of the season. We're told that all of these rookies are have some of the best fantasy pedigree going around. But I mean, you just have to look at it. And Andrew Brayshaw, who's one of the premium midfielders of the comp now, had junior numbers that were incredible, but he only averaged 60 in his first year at Freo, playing a forward wing role. Like, these rookies aren't a given. And just because they're there round one doesn't mean they're going to have roles in the AFL teams that are going to be conducive to scoring either. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think the midfield's the one where people are saying you can start sort of 2-3. I've even seen some people starting like 4 mid rookies just because the amount that are there. And obviously we've got one in the forward line, and then a lot of people got one in defence as well, potentially 2 in forward or defence as well. I still think with the condensed buys, it's because it's not as prolonged as much. I think last year allowed people to get away with having a rookie too long because we were the best 18 in round 6 was the last one, then into round 7. Whereas this year it's going to be round 5 is back to best 22. And that's sort of when people are starting to get into the upgrade season. So I feel like having more value players, it'll be the better way this year because it'll be easy to get those guys up to the undervalued premiums coming off their early buys, or maybe had a down week or something like that. So I think still starting as less rookies as possible is best because even in best 18, people say, if you start extra rookies, then they'll just sort of drop off your score anyway. But if you've got more mid prices and they all put up 70s and 80s, and all of a sudden your lower scores are getting lower, and then your your floor scores all in your best 18 are getting higher. So I think that I'd probably be starting. I've been playing around with about probably 4 or 5 rookies. It's more likely 5 at the moment, but I've toyed with a few structures with 4. 6, I've had a few structures as well, but I think I'm not sure about if 6 is too many. That's sort of the thing I'm weighing up with opening round. So, well, currently, how many rookies do you have sort of in a couple of drafts, or how many have you been playing with on your field at the moment?
Yeah, mine kind of lands at 4 or 5. 1 in defence, 2 in the midfield, and then it's between. I mean, Hewitt at F6 is a rookie, but I've currently got like a Neil Erasmus type at F5 that doesn't look like a rookie, but in reality he is. So I suppose it's around that sort of 4 to 5 range, but the rookies are just placeholders. We don't know what rookies we're going to get. So it's always got to treat that with caution as well.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously we hear a lot of people as well say rookies can dictate structure. And if we get a few of these rookies putting up really strong scores early, then we could look at sort of how that fits. But yeah, I do agree with that point though, that I think probably the value plays is where I'm currently looking at. But it'll be interesting to see how that does shape over the preseason as well. So just to finish up as well, I thought we'd just chat through just a couple of players of note that are sort of popular in fantasy at the moment that have got the early buy as well. So I think we'll just quickly touch on the round 2 players, because I don't think there are too many that were starting. But is there any sort of player from round 2 from Gold Coast or GWS that you're sort of really heavily considering ahead of obviously the preseason?
Well, I touched on him before. Like, it's hard not to be interested in a Dan Rioli going to Gold Coast. He's been recruited for a reason to play that role, and we've seen Flanders flourish in that role, and we've seen Alex Sexton of all people score well in that role as well. So it's hard not to be interested there. Although he did have the knee injury in preseason, so I'm not sure if he's fully training. But he's one I'm keeping my eye on, and that's really it. Your GWS players, I think, are all. I mean, Cornelio's interesting. He's priced very cheaply, but he's 31, 32 now, and how that GWS midfield lines up is anyone's guess with Bedford going in there. But he's one I'll keep tabs on in the preseason to see how he's tracking. But outside of that, I think a lot of the players are pretty fairly priced. What are you thinking with the Tom Green? I was pretty keen early, but yeah, a little bit gone off him a bit since. So what do you think?
Yeah, he was actually the one I was just about to ask you about as well. He's an interesting one because we chatted about him on our first episode just before Christmas, and Tim, Jaiden, and Jordox were sort of pretty happy to start him. And obviously, I haven't chatted to him about Tom Green specifically since. But I'm a bit like you. I was fairly keen to start him. He's priced at 99, so essentially 100. So he's clearly value there. But just with the very early buy and the fact that he's got Hawthorn in round 3, and we know that O'Connor Nash likes going to him when they have got that matchup. So if you're looking at the first 2 games and then a bye and then a Connor Nash sort of run with there, I'm not as keen to start. I think it might be good to watch how that Giants midfield works with the loss of Peatling and Perryman did run through there at times, but just a couple of sort of moving pieces. Does Callahan get thrown in there a bit more? Cornelia obviously fully fit. Do they continue with the Bedford tag? So at the moment, he's still on the watch list. And if you put up a 120, 130 in the preseason, it might be hard to leave him out if he's going to make cash early and maybe get away from us when we're looking at bringing him in round 4, round 5. So
well, I'll give you a hypothetical, Bales, because he has Collingwood in opening round, doesn't he?
Yeah.
So there's no tag, I wouldn't have thought, coming from Collingwood, and you'd think that's a pretty easy matchup at home. Say he comes out and goes, 120 plus. What are you doing?
So yeah, 120 is like, if it was 130 plus, I'd be saying yeah, but 120, it would. I'd probably have to look at the other options. Like I'm keen on like a Taranto or a Connor Rosie around that sort of same price, and Brayshaw as well. I'm quite keen on. So probably come down to what I've seen from their roles in the preseason, but if he puts up a 120, it would be hard to pass up. He's got Melbourne in round 1 as well, which is a pretty decent matchup based on last year as well. And we'll see how sort of Melbourne are looking like. But 120 would definitely get me interested. And he's on the watch list already, but that would sort of bump him right up there. What are your thoughts on Tom Green, if that would sort of be a score that would put him into your team?
Yeah, look, I love Tom Green, but talking to Mitch on the Holmes Files earlier in the preseason was what we need to figure out was that year that he went 108, was that an outlier, or is that what we expect him to be? And he kind of gives off the vibes that if he's dominating, he needs high possession games to score well in fantasy. And if he's having those high possession games, then teams are going to be putting attention into him. So he seems like he might be one of those players that has a bit of a flaw. Yes, he's going to have his ceiling games at times, but I think he might be more in the Patrick Cripps mold, where he's that 100 to 105 averaging player because of the hard work that he has to do, and the easy ball isn't really there around the ground for him. Although we did see it in 2023, he was able to do it, but do GWS want him playing that way? I'm not too sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think that Connor Nash potential run with in round 3 as well adds another layer. I think if he didn't have that, I'd be a bit more keen to start him. But yeah, I think when it comes to, again, the premiums, just because there's so many options around his price that, as you say, it would have to be a pretty good score in opening round to really look at it. Because I'm quite keen on like an Andrew Brayshaw, for example. He's currently sitting as my M1 at the moment, and I think he presents a lot of value. A lot of other players, I think there's a lot of midfielders that present a lot of value as well. Obviously, we got news as well about obviously Nick Newman being out as well. Does that put like a Doherty more into discussion? Obviously, Chair has been discussed. Will Day obviously has got an early buy as well, but he's value. Like, a lot of these players are either value or potentially underpriced in the midfield. So Tom Green's a tricky one. I think that'll be a good discussion that from all the podcasts around there to see what people are looking at there. Then we've chatted mostly about the round 3 bye, just because they're obviously with a few options there. But in terms of those defenders, obviously we've chatted about Mills and Con. But what are your thoughts on like a Perryman, the guys at Geelong, like a Holmes, Stewart, Humphreys, those type of guys? What are your thoughts on those ones? Because I feel like everyone's talking about the Sydney duo and Kenning Con, but not as much about the Geelong and Collingwood defenders.
Yeah, look, we can start with Perryman, and I'll admit he was someone initially that I wasn't very keen on, but I am warming up to the idea, and there's a few reasons why. The first reason is that Collingwood seem pretty depleted in the midfield at the moment. They've lost Tom Mitchell to an injury. The timeline on that isn't clear, but at the moment he's not there, and we now know that Nick Dacos is dealing with this foot injury as well. So there's 2 of their main ball winners out of the side. And if we look at the half back line of Collingwood, they're already pretty stacked, and they're adding Dan Houston to that mix as well. So unless they're actually planning on Dan Houston playing a little bit more in the midfield and Perryman playing at half back, I do see a bit of a role there for Perryman, kind of in the similar vein of what Jack Crisp was able to do last year, and go into the midfield, apply that sort of tackle pressure, but still get the ball on the outside as well. So that's why I'm kind of liking Perryman at the moment. And yes, the Collingwood system doesn't score very well, but Crisp had no issues in that role last year alongside Dacos, the 2 Dacos boys. So I think there may be a role there for him. I just need to see it in preseason, but the issue is that Dan Houston isn't playing round 0 because of suspension. So is that going to change come round 1? That'll be the interesting talking point.
Yeah, 100%. Is Dan Houston as someone that's sort of crossed off your list and you're just waiting to maybe to after his buy and what his role looks like? You wouldn't be touching him without seeing him in opening round?
Yeah, I'd need to see it in opening round, but he's one that he scored pretty well in a Port Adelaide system that wasn't very conducive to scoring. And yes, he's going into a Collingwood system that also isn't very good for scoring, but Nick Dacos used to score very well in that half back line when he was down there. And even Josh Dacos, when he's had a few games down there, has scored very well as well. So if they do want to funnel all the ball through Dan Houston, then there is potential for a career season for him. But it would be a very ballsy coach to pick him without seeing any data in round 0, I would have thought, with the early round buy as well.
Yeah, you have to be pretty bullish after seeing those couple of preseason games on Houston to really launch him, but I'm probably crossing him off. Those Geelong defenders, Holmes, Stewart, Humphreys, any sort of interest with any of those three guys? Obviously, Holmes is creeping up towards that $1 million mark, so he might not be as much value as a Stewart and a Humphreys, but your thoughts on the Geelong trio there?
Yeah, so Holmes is the one I'm actually the most keen in. I think looking at the stats, he went at 100 pre-buy and then he must have gone at close to 90 post-buy if he's come out with a 95 average. But he's at that age bracket now where really we shouldn't have seen his prime yet. He should be coming into it, and what that means for fantasy, I'm not too sure. I think he suits that half back role a little bit better where he can get on the outside. But if he's got that blended midfield role with the half back, where he's able to get some tackles as well as win the ball on the outside, he has the tools to average over 100. Now, whether that happens or not, you'd be banking on natural progression, which is not something I like to do, which is why I'm not really interested in Humphreys either, having not seen it for very much in the AFL. But Max Holmes does have the tools. I have him ranked pretty highly in my draft rankings, but I'm not sure I'm willing to start him with that early buy. But if come mid-season he's up there in the top 6 defenders and he's averaging 100, it wouldn't surprise me either.
Yeah, and I think the role's a big thing for Holmes as well, is that because the other pieces there, obviously Bailey Smith's obviously at Geelong now. We've been hearing he's going to be playing inside mid, so obviously Tom Stewart as well was playing a little bit of mid and then going back. So does that sort of have an effect on Holmes? So I think he's a good one to watch early as well and see how he goes, and then look at him in sort of the upgrade season if you're looking to upgrade or around those mid-season buys. And then the final opening round is obviously from Sydney and Essendon. So just a couple of players here. So James Sicily, probably the main one in defence that a few people are quite keen on. I was keen on. I've sort of gone a little bit cooler as pre-season's gone on. Obviously, Barrass and Battle being there should allow him to be that sort of third tall, but with Kaushadir and Mitch Lewis having injuries and sort of not sure if they're going to play opening round or how long they're out for, is that sort of a bit of a concern for you? Would you prefer to wait till after his early buy, or do you think if you're seeing the role in the preseason and an opening round for Sicily, he could be someone that you might jump on?
Yes, Sicily's interesting. I don't typically like to pick players that have uncertainty in their role. Like you pick them and it all seems good, but as soon as they get flicked forward, for example, all of a sudden it's the most obvious thing in the world that you've missed and you hate yourself for it. But he's interesting because Hawthorn started very slow last year. I think they were 2-6 or whatever they were, and then made the finals. But after round 6, I think I looked at the numbers. Sicily actually averaged 94, which is what you kind of think of him as a 94 to 96 type player. I think the 104 plus year from the previous season, I think that's going to be an outlier year just because of how poor Hawthorn were, and that was just the brand that they needed to play to get through the season. I think with Hawthorn flying up the ladder and being competitive, I don't see them as playing that chip style that made Sicily the knockout pick that he was the year prior. I do see him as a 95-ish guy, but I think it's too risky knowing that he could play forward at any moment, especially at the start of the year where their forward line's depleted. And if you actually have a look back to last year, the first game against Essendon, he had that 30 and they were getting into him every opportunity that they could. And they've got Essendon again round 1 this year. So if you picked him and he went a 30, you'd be kicking yourself. So that's the reason I'm not considering a Sicily this year to start at least.
Would he be one of those players that even if he put up a massive ceiling score in opening round, that with that round 1 potential sort of tag there and uncertainty, that even if you put up a 120, 130, would you still be a bit less sort of cautious on starting him because of those reasons? Or do you think it might sort of force your hand if he puts up a massive ceiling score in opening round?
Look, until it happens, I'm not going to rule it out. But at the same time, we know that's what James Sicily can do. We know he can go 140, 150 on any given day, but we also know that he can go 40 on any given day. So I think we know what James Sicily is. And if he does have a ceiling game in round 0, but then a stinker in round 1, then you can't really complain because that's what he does. But at the same time, if he gets off to a flyer and he is that third intercepting defender and he's able to just rack up the pill at will back there, then he's an obvious pick. But I don't see it now, especially with Carl Amon being there and them deciding that they want to just play that hawk ball, get it forward because it worked so well for them last year.
Yeah, exactly. Just another player for Hawthorn, Will Day is another one that is getting a bit of love as a bit of a value player. Just your thoughts on him. But just sort of before I ask you as well, he's got obviously his value, but there's a few sort of early potential tags. I know it's obviously very, very early. We can't really take in tags too much, but he's got Sydney in opening round. We know Sydney have done a few run with roles there. Then they've got Essendon, who sometimes can the midfield, but they're not. But then you've got Carlton, who obviously we've seen likes of Hewitt being deployed there. GWS, where we've seen Bedford do plenty of jobs there. Then they've got that early buy. So your thoughts on sort of Will Day and sort of your thoughts on the potential early attention that he might receive?
Yeah, so Will Day was someone that I initially penciled in at the end of last season as someone that I knew was going to be value to start 2025. He's since had off-season shoulder surgery, I think. So he's coming off a limited preseason. So he's not back in match sim yet. So he's going to be fit legs-wise, but he hasn't been doing a full preseason. But the main reason I'm not interested in starting a Will Day at this point in time is the run that you highlighted. So we know that these players need to get off to an absolute hot start to be value in your starting squads. Do I think Will Day can finish this year with an average of 95 plus? Absolutely. But if he doesn't do it to start the year, then he's a wasted pick. If we look at Dom Sheed from 2 years ago, a lot of us started him at a 70-ish price tag, hoping that he could, average 90 plus and be a good value pick. And he averaged 90 for the year, but he was slow to start over the first month, which means we all jumped off and sort of didn't make any money on him. So it's about when they can do it. And the run that Will Day has to start, yes, he's a good player, but the data would suggest that he's going to find it pretty hard in that first month.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. Final Hawthorn player was Dylan Moore. Obviously, few people have been saying that F1 spot can be a bit tricky. Horn Francis is quite popular, but I'm not sure if I see enough sort of, I guess, upside there. He's probably going to go at what he's priced at. Dylan Moore is someone that has been fairly safe. Is he sort of one of those guys at top price premium in the forward line you wouldn't be starting with that early buy, or do you think there might be a bit of merit to him starting with him?
Look, if he averaged 95 for the year, it wouldn't shock me. He started the year slowly last year because he was coming off the glandular fever, but he put up some big scores in the back half of the year. So if you're looking at that, there is potential for upside, but he plays one of the hardest roles in the AFL, that high half forward role, and he does it better than almost anyone. I think he's probably the best at it. It's just not conducive for scoring. We see him put up these ceiling scores when Hawthorn have it on their terms, which they should have this year. But he also has these random 60 floor games that can't really be explained as well. So I think he's someone that is probably going to be a top 6 forward, but I think someone that we could probably afford to wait on to potentially get a few floor scores in a row to get him cheaper at some point.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just quickly on the Bombers, only a couple of names here because I don't think there's too many guys from the Bombers, but Archie Roberts is someone else that's been getting a bit of buzz. Obviously, he's got that discount from what he did. Obviously, only played the 4 games at the end of the year. Is he someone a bit like Humphreys, where you probably you'd rather see it first and then jump on after instead of really? Well, obviously, we get the chance not round to see it. So, is he someone that you'd prefer to sort of leave until after his bye, or do you think that depending on what he does in the opening round, that you could see yourself starting a guy like Archie Roberts?
Yeah, look, one thing that Mitch also drilled into me on the Ball Boys is the value of actually having a decent sample size. And we've seen 4 games from Archie Roberts, and we've seen 4 games at the end of the year where, maybe teams are playing a little bit more chip to sort of preserve and get through to the end of the season. Yes, Essendon were in the hunt for finals, but at the same time, some of the other teams might have just been allowing a little bit more ball back there. And there's talk that he's training on a wing. I think the word is that they see him as more of a winger. Their backline's pretty stacked as it is, but Nick Martin, there's word that he's going out of there, so maybe there is a spot for him at halfback. But yeah, a 4-game sample size is enough for me to to start him at that elevated price, unfortunately.
Yeah, which sucks because he would have been a guy that I think we all jumped on if he was under 400k, but unfortunately he's a bit too expensive. Obviously, we've been hearing rumours of Zach Merritt training off half back as well, whether that sort of eventuates towards a pre-season or if they're just trying to give some other guys run through in match sim and that to sort of, because they know what Zach Merritt does. Is there anyone from that sort of potential Bombers midfield? Like I've currently got a Ben Hobbs sitting at F5 just as a placeholder at the moment, as a cheaper guy on the forward line. A few people talk like an Archie Perkins or someone like that. Like, is there any sort of interest in any guys? Like Nick Martin's even got some, apparently, a few midfield minutes in pre-season as well. Is there any sort of interest in any of those guys that might get some Essendon midfield time?
Look, I mean, I always get drawn back to a Darcy Parish, and it's hard not to. He went 106 and 102 in the 2 years previous and being priced in the low 90s. There's clear value there. He's another one that's always seems to be injured. He's got a pretty tough run to start, so that's why I'm kind of off a Darcy Parish. But if you had a spreadsheet that just had the numbers and it didn't have the players attached to it, he's someone that you definitely look at with what he's done in the past. But he's another one of those players that needs massive possession numbers to really score. And they've now got Caldwell and some other players, Durham, coming through that midfield that they probably want to spread the load a little bit more. So Darcy Parish, because of his run, I'm not that keen on, and I'm not really keen on any of the other Essendon midfielders. A name that is kind of interesting to me is Jordan Ridley. Now he's pretty inflated and he does have the bye, so probably won't go there. But taking out his injured scores last year, he actually scored really, really well. And what we do know for that Bombers backline is that they're the highest averaging backline in the comp. I think you had Nick Martin and then you had McGrath, Redmond, Ridley, all average in the 80s. So they score backline. Yeah, and Roberts in the end as well. Surely at some point, Essendon need to change up their game style when every other team in the comp is moving to a more Richmond run and gun style. Essendon seem to be stuck in 2021 playing chip to chip in the back line, but for some reason he interests me, but I also think he falls in that mold of needing to lock down and play team footy at times rather than really racking up the footy.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. If he was B1, if put up a massive score in opening round, he could be someone that, as we've talked about with Chris, if you put up a 120, for example, could you start him for the first 3 rounds and trade him at round 4? Because he's had those price increases and then you can end up trading him. So he's someone that I've sort of got there and sort of see what he does in opening round and what that role is and if Essendon do change anything. Yeah. But yeah, that's it.
The issue is, Bales, the issue is, though, it might be fool's gold because they do have Gold Coast in round 0, which you'd assume is going to be a bit of a points fest, but then they go into Hawthorn, Adelaide and Port Adelaide before their bye. So it's
incredibly tough.
It's as tough a run as any, really. So you got to be careful with Essendon players.
Exactly. And that's what we're saying as well, where you sort of, those opening scores, you got to sort of take all the factors in, not just what they score in opening round. You got to see the role, you got to see upcoming run, especially for those value players as well. So it's opening round, as we said, is adding another layer of strategy to fantasy as well. So any sort of final closing thoughts you want to touch on with opening round before we wrap up?
Nah, look, I'm really looking forward to the fantasy season. I think it's going to be the best one yet. There's lots of reports and stuff flying around on Twitter at the moment for match sims and things like that. Just please be careful. The old 2 midfields, the Zach Merritt rumor of halfback. Like, what do Essendon really gain from having Zach Merritt in the midfield during match simulation in preseason this far out? They don't gain anything. They know exactly what they're going to get from Zach Merritt. They got to see what they can get from their other midfielders that are vying for those spots. So really just take note of things that you're seeing, but it's not until we see actual official practice matches in round 0 that we really need to be taking note of roles, because so much happens in the preseason. Yeah,
exactly right. And obviously we did see with preseason injuries as well, just keep an eye on that for potential roles, role change and stuff like that as well. But yeah, as you say, good point that a lot of midfields, they're playing 2 and they're probably not playing their stars in there necessarily because they want to see what they've got from some other younger players. But that'll wrap us up there for our opening round chat. But Holmsey, mate, thank you very much for jumping on with us. Firstly, where can the people find you across the socials? And obviously, it's good to hear the pod. Obviously, back on our airways as well. And obviously with the Holmes Files, what can the listeners be expecting from yourself and the pod and the Holmes Files for the remainder of the preseason and going into the 2025 season?
Yeah, look, the pod pod's back up and running, which is good. With Louis and Harmy and whoever else we can scrounge up. I'm sure you'll make an appearance at some point, Bales. You're always the first one to put your hand up if we need someone to jump on. But yeah, we've got the regular podcast coming out on the Monday, so we're doing our positional previews at the moment, which has been good, like a lot of the podcasts are, and then the Holmes file. So I've been getting one out a week at the moment, which is really good. Hopefully can continue that, the one-on-one interviews and really being able to deep dive into the strategy side, I think is really valuable and not something that we get from a lot of the other podcasts, which I think is important. We don't want all the content to be the same. So I've really been enjoying those, and I hope the listeners have as well.
Yeah, no, the Holmes Files has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed listening to all the fantastic guests that have jumped on there. And not only am I going to get a hat this year, I'm going to make a appearance on the Holmes Files in 2026. So that'll be my goal to get the two things happening this season. But Holmesy, thank you very much for jumping on. And if any listeners out there, obviously, if you've got any questions, fire them through below, sort of in the comments section, or ask me on Q as well. The link for that is at the top of the description as well. Make sure you smash a like on the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Plenty more content coming in the preseason. We've also got the head-to-head series that will be starting in a couple of weeks' time as well in February. We'll be getting plenty of good guests on to chat about a lot of players as we gear up towards the 2025 season, which is it's under 60 days away, that's for sure. So it's coming thick and fast. But thanks, everyone, for tuning in. And, we'll catch you later for another episode. So thanks, everyone. See ya.
Bye.